My name is John Sluter. I'm your Bible friend from Purdue. This is part 10 of a series on King Saul of ancient Israel. Today we're going to discuss 1 Shemuel chapters 13, 14, and 15. These are pivotal chapters. These are the chapters in which Saul continues to rack up victories, but in racking up his victories, he also does things that alienate God, cause God to strip away from him his kingship. These are the chapters in which we begin to see in 1 Shemuel the pivot away from the dynasty of Saul to the beginning of the dynasty of King David. Remember that by the end of chapter 12, Saul had just won a great victory over King Nahash of the Ammonites, and he was re-anointed in Gilgal. Shemuel had given as it were, valedictory speech and communicated to the Israelites that from this point forward he envisioned Israel with two leaders, a spiritual leader, him, and Saul as the secular leader, the military leader. Now, Saul has taken to himself 3,000 picked men. 2,000 of them are with him in Michmash. That's a territory about 7 miles from Jerusalem. It's in a high place. It's easily defended. 1,000 are with his son Jonathan. They're in Gibbach. Gibbach happens to be a place also where there's a Philistine garrison. Jonathan kills the Philistine prefect at that garrison. Your translation might say that he defeated the garrison. I'm not going to go into the whys and the wherefores of the different translations. There are people who can do that so much better than I can. In this particular instance, I'm going with the translation of Robert Alter, which he explains in his book on the book of 1 Shemuel. After Jonathan assassinates the Philistine prefect, the Philistines respond as any great power would. They can't let this provocation go unanswered. They enter Israel with a huge army, and they occupy Michmash. Meanwhile, Saul has fled to Gilgal, and he has gathered Israel to him. He's been instructed to wait 7 days for Shemuel to join him so that Shemuel can perform the sacrifice to bless the battle on behalf of the Israelites. But as the days go by, as those 7 days go by, and he does not see Shemuel, he panics. People are slipping away. No surprise. Sometimes it can be more unnerving to wait for a battle, to anticipate a battle, than it can be to actually be in the battle. So what does Saul do? He says, "Bring the animals to me." And he performs the sacrifice that otherwise Shemuel would have performed. Just then Shemuel shows up. And Shemuel says, "What have you done?" Saul explains that he was afraid that the Philistines might set upon him before he had had the opportunity to enlist God's help by means of the sacrifice. So he did it himself. Shemuel tells him he's done a very foolish thing, that God would have established his authority forever if he had simply done what God told him to do, but he didn't. So now God was determined to find a replacement whom he was looking for even as they spoke, and that the kingship of Israel would be ripped away from Saul. So, Saul and his son Jonathan go their way. Shemuel goes his way. They part company. And Saul and Jonathan boldly go to confront the Philistines. They go to where the Philistines are in Michmash. But Michmash is a mismatch, and Saul, unwilling to attack them with the 600 people that he has left, sits more or less inert under a pomegranate tree. His son Jonathan, just as he was the one who killed the prefect, takes the initiative now. He consults with his armor bearer. He says, let's confront these Philistines. If they say that they're going to come down to us, we'll melt away. But if they call us up to them, then we know that God has given them into our hands. And that's what happens. They come within hailing distance of the Philistines, and the Philistines respond by saying, hey, come up. We want to show you something. Unquestionably, there was a lot of winking and nudging among the Philistines. Maybe there was between Jonathan and his armor bearer. They go up, and they start to slaughter the Philistines. And there's a panic among the Philistines. It's so pronounced, even where Saul is, his lookout, are able to see that there's some kind of tumult going on. They alert Saul. And Saul consults the great-grandson of Eli, the grandson of Phinehas, who's with him. Phinehas, of course, is he and his brother were the ones who disgraced the house of Eli and brought about its destruction and the loss of the ark. Anyway, Saul says, bring your ephod, and he wants to consult God about whether he should attack. But it's so clear that there's something dramatic going on that he doesn't even wait for the end of the divination that he is called for. And they attack. And while they're attacking, even the people, the Israelites who have gone over to the Philistines, turn on their new masters, join with Saul, and the people who have melted away in fear and trepidation while waiting for Shemuel now join in the general slaughter, and the Philistines are defeated soundly. So, it's a happy ending for the forces of ancient Israel, right? Not quite. Because before leading his troops into battle, Saul presses a rash oath upon his forces. He has them swear that cursed be anyone who tastes food before evening and before Saul has had revenge upon his enemies, these Philistines. And here's the problem. One of the problems. Jonathan ain't there. He doesn't know about the oath. And while the Israelites are slaughtering the Philistines during that day, Jonathan and others come upon this delicious honey that's dripping on the ground from a honeycomb. And all the troops are mindful of the oath that they've made to their king Saul and to God, and they pass it by. But Jonathan's not aware of the oath, and he tastes the honey. And others warn him, hey, we've made this oath. Cursed is anybody who eats before the end of the day and before the Israelites are revenged on the Philistines. And Jonathan reasonably says, well, my father's brought trouble on our forces. Jonathan is right. The troops are so hungry that at the first moment they can, they fall upon the animals, the spoil that is before them from the slaughter. And they're so hungry that they don't cook the meat. They eat it with the blood in it. And that's reported to Saul. And Saul says, well, don't let them do that. Have them bring the food here, and we'll sacrifice it, we'll cook it, and they can eat without sinning. And that's what happens. Now, Saul wants to pursue the Philistines all night. And so they bring out the ephod, they consult God, but God does not answer. And that's troubling. So, it's determined that there must be some sin on the part of Israel, and they determine by lots that it's Jonathan. And echoing what Shemuel said to Saul after Saul had made the precipitous sacrifice in Gilgal, Saul says to Jonathan, "What have you done?" And Jonathan admits that he tasted a little honey during the day, and mindful of his oath, Saul says, "Jonathan, you shall surely die now." And he's prepared to take his own son's life. But the troops intervene. They say, "Jonathan has saved the day. He has brought us victory. Don't do this thing." And Saul relents. Now let's look back at this narrative and see what's going on a slightly deeper level. What was wrong with what Saul did at Gilgal in failing to wait for Shemuel? For one thing, he failed to understand the sufficiency of God and the strength of God. He trembled because his forces were diminishing down to 600. And because he was afraid, he was showing an ignorance of God, and he was showing an ignorance, willful or not, of the history of his people, the Israelites, and of his own family, his own tribe, the Benjamites, because he should have known the story of Gideon. Gideon, who defeated the Midianites, a huge army of them with only 300 picked men, the bravest of the brave. And he ignored even his recent tribal history because not too many generations before, maybe as separated from him as the Vietnam era is separated from us now, such that there were probably still people living who remembered this. The Benjamites were at war with the rest of the Israelites, and the survivors of Benjamin, 600 of them, were able to hold off all of the rest of the tribes. He was forgetting the Exodus, how the slaves escaping from Egypt had escaped, and God had dealt with the mighty army of Pharaoh that pursued them. So, it showed a lack of faith. Sometimes a lack of faith is curable, and it probably was in this case, if he had just waited. That's why Shemuel was important, because while Saul was growing his faith, growing his confidence by seeing God give him victory over against the odds, he could have leaned on the faith of Shemuel, and Shemuel could have guided him, but he didn't wait for Shemuel. even though he knew from his first encounter with Shemuel that Shemuel was the man that everybody waited for. The other problem is that one of the problems that kings have is that after reigning for a while, their power goes to their head. And by having a, as it were, dual headship of the Israelites, the secular ruler, the military ruler Saul, and the spiritual ruler Shemuel, there was a way around that problem, because Saul could be accountable to Shemuel, but by usurping Shemuel's role and doing the sacrifice for himself, Saul had disgraced Shemuel, had signaled that there was no special need for Shemuel, had turned his back on Shemuel, had alienated Shemuel, and eroded Shemuel's ability to be that accountability. And for that reason, Saul proved himself inadequate to be a king. That inadequacy manifests itself immediately. And at this point we begin to see contrasts. Contrast between Saul and his son Jonathan, and Saul in what he had been before. With respect to Saul and Jonathan, Saul is sitting under a pomegranate tree. He's beholding the camp of the Philistines, but he's not doing anything about it. Meanwhile, Jonathan and his armor-bearer decide that they're going to alone take on these Philistines because they trust that with only a few, God can give victory. It's clear that Jonathan and his armor-bearer believe that they have an appointment with destiny. The relationship between Jonathan and his armor-bearer is an interesting contrast with the relationship between Saul and his servant that we saw at the beginning when Saul and his servant were out and about looking for Saul's father's lost donkeys. Jonathan, in this case, is clearly the leader of this duo, as he should be. Earlier, when Saul was out and about with his servant, it was the servant who kept on coming up with the ideas. He was the initiator of the process through which Saul eventually came in contact with Shemuel. And so there's that contrast. There's also the contrast between what Saul was and what Saul was before. We're going to talk a little bit more about this at a later time, but in the meantime, we're just going to point out the contrast. That is, the decisive Saul, the Saul that took on the Ammonites, the Saul that put everything on the line, even his own future, to break the siege of King Nahash. And the Saul here who's just passive. This Saul is always waiting for something. He's waiting for some kind of sign, some kind of signal. Even when he sees the tumult of the Philistines, he doesn't immediately take action, but goes to, as it were, consult his priest, to have him consult God. Not a bad thing, but it shows a lack of decisiveness. And it contrasts the confidence that Jonathan has, the active role that Jonathan plays, who takes action and lets the events as they unfold dictate whether God is for him or against him. There's a certain genius to Jonathan's determination that God has determined to give the Philistines into his hands. Because if the Philistines actually invite an enemy into their camp, that shows that they are overconfident. And that's why when Jonathan surprised them by his ability There was panic among them. It's the last thing that they expected. How did Jonathan surprise them? Well, we know from a little episode, a little blurb at the end of chapter 13, that the Philistines had oppressed the Israelites to the extent that the Israelites were not even permitted to have their own blacksmiths. So the Israelites had no swords or spears because there simply were no blacksmiths to produce these weapons, except that there were a few, and these were in the possession of Saul and Jonathan personally. But the Philistines that called Jonathan up, who made Jonathan, as it were, a living Trojan horse, had no idea that they were dealing with the son of a king. They had no idea that he had armaments that otherwise the Israelites did not have. So when he came up, and when his armor bearer came up, no doubt concealing their weapons as they climbed, they were much more capable martially than the Philistines expected them to be, and that's what caused the panic. And now we come to the truly tragic dimension of this story. It's the curse that Saul laid upon his son, apparently without knowing what he was doing. Saul was zealous. And there's nothing wrong with what he ordered. Sometimes the taking of spoils prematurely can turn what might have been a military rout into a lesser victory. But a commander has to be conscious of the facts on the ground, and Saul might have looked around him and seen the hunger of his soldiers and hesitated to impose this added burden on them. Perhaps this shows the tragic influence of Shemuel's absence. There was nobody to stand up to Saul, nobody with Shemuel's experience in leadership to say, this is probably not the time, not the place for that. And perhaps if Shemuel had been present, Saul wouldn't have felt the need to do something extravagant like impose further hunger upon his troops in order to enlist the help of God. And now we can look at the cursing of Jonathan and the, as it were, self-cursing of Saul. I think people today are not as aware of the importance of curses and blessings as the people of ancient Israel were. And to get into the mindset of the ancient Israelites a little bit, all you have to do is look at the story of Jacob and Esau, the sons of Isaac, and how Jacob and his mother Rebekah plotted to snake away the blessing of Isaac that should have gone to the elder son Esau. Jacob clearly wanted the blessing, but he feared to join his mother's plot at first because he was afraid that it would blow up, and then he would not get the blessing he sought. He would gain his father's curse. Of course, Esau discovered that his blessing had been stolen away from him, one that he was entitled to both as the elder son and as the more beloved son of Isaac. And when he found out, he wailed. He also made plans to kill Jacob. All of this should suggest that the ancient Israelites saw blessings and curses, especially a father's blessing and curse, as a very big deal. And so here we have Saul enlisting his 600 men all to join together and curse anybody who eats before the end of the day and before Saul has won his victory. So it's a mighty curse. A very promising leader, a charismatic leader, a faithful leader, a bold leader was cursed. Saul ended up cursing his own son without knowing it. And he ended up cursing himself. Robert Alter points out that the way this story is set up, it's pretty clear that the writer of 1 Shemuel is inviting the reader to think about the book of Judges and the story of Jephthah and his daughter. Jephthah famously is going into battle and promises God that if God will only give him victory over his enemies, when he gets home, he will sacrifice to God the first that comes out of his tent to greet him. Probably he expects it to be a servant, but it's his only child, his beloved daughter. And at first, Jephthah refuses to honor his oath. It's his daughter who tells him, "Father, if you have promised God this thing, you must do it." So she goes off into the wilderness with her friends and spends some time mourning the fact that she will never grow into adulthood. Then she comes back down from the mountain and gives herself up to her father's rash promise. She's one of the lesser known but great heroes of the Hebrew Bible. Saul does a reverse Jephthah. Jephthah, his first reaction was, "I'm not going to do what I said." And Saul's first reaction was, "Jonathan, because of what you've done, you have to die." Jephthah's daughter talks him into doing the right thing. Saul's men talk him into forgetting his oath, not doing what he promised God to do. And so, by doing so, he cursed himself. Jonathan and Saul now are under a curse. And this is the turning point of the story of Saul's dynasty. This is where it went from ascending to descending. At this point, we begin to enter the story of the ascent of David in a little bit. In chapters 13 and 14, we see a King Saul who is responding to events, not taking decisive action himself. This is in contrast to what we saw earlier when Saul responded to the threat of King Nahash and the Ammonites. He took decisive action. He made a good strategy. He executed it expertly. Here, he seems to plod and blunder. And it seems to me that one of three things are going on. One possibility is that the author of 1 Shemuel is showing the immediate consequence of Saul's rift with the prophet Shemuel. Alienated from Shemuel, he lacks the self-confidence that he needs to be a king and to act decisively and to lead Israel. The second possibility is that the writer of 1 Shemuel is blending together two traditions that are fundamentally at odds, that fundamentally describe Saul in different ways. He's either a decisive leader, or he's kind of a putz, maybe a placeholder, until he can pass on to his reward and his better son can take his place. The third possibility is that there is a war going on within King Saul. Maybe it's the ordinary kind of internal war that we all experience, the war between good and evil, the war between different aspects of what we want, what we do, what we think. It might be something more dramatic. It might foreshadow what we will see as the book of 1 Shemuel progresses, the mental disorder of King Saul. Perhaps he suffered from something like manic depressive disorder. Perhaps when he went to war against the Ammonites, he was in a manic phase and very capable, extraordinarily capable. But when he goes to war against the Philistines, he is either in a depressive phase or in a liminal phase between the manic phase and the depressive phase. Or maybe he even suffers from what was once called multiple personality disorder. I think the more current term is dissociative identity disorder. Saul might have interpreted his fractured relationship with Shemuel as a betrayal. That, and given the warlike conditions, post-traumatic stress disorder is a possibility. Or maybe it's best to set aside all pretense of scientific inquiry and simply say, God's Spirit has begun to withdraw from Saul, and he is returning to what he was before the Spirit of God invested him. These are some ideas that we will explore more when we get into chapter 15 of 1 Shemuel and beyond.